Oh, are we started? Hello, good evening. Greetings from Washington, D.C. I thought I was going to get cued by Joy. Thank you to Tadaima and JANM for organizing this session. I'm really honored to be able to introduce this session, which is Collecting and Preserving a Community's History. So this session is about the collections process. It features institutions that are committed to saving and caring for materials that document Japanese American history. So we're going to hear from representatives of the National Park Service, the National Japanese American Historical Society, the Japanese American National Museum, and the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. So collection practices, the development of collections, access to collections are extremely important to reparative and restorative history work. And so as with the mission of Tadaima, collections can do the work to make sure that histories and experiences that had previously been absent or silent in the archives or in public memory are actually remembered. Collections can help make sure that the histories which in earlier generations were not documented or prioritized by scholars or curators are now valued for their historical significance and stewarded with appropriate context and respect. So I worked many years at JANM, which was a great honor. I love that collection. I'm currently a curator at the Smithsonian, which is not one museum, but in fact 19 museums, the National Zoo, and a number of other research centers, all of which care for their own different collections, which differ in topic scopes and scale, how they're accessed, who uses them. And some of these collections actually house materials related to Japanese American experiences and culture, some specific to World War II. And so, I count the Smithsonian as among a really robust network of organizations across the country, some developed right out of Japanese American communities, others not, but who are today preserving and interpreting the history of Japanese Americans. And the point being that there's really so much work to do to share and preserve the complexity of this history that no one organization can do it. You need a network, a landscape of organizations to collectively do this work to make sure that this history is accessible as far and as wide as possible, not just in DC, not just on the West Coast, not just in Wyoming. So the idea for this session comes from our JANM organizers, Joy Yamaguchi and Clement Hanami, who were inspired by the Minidoka pilgrimage back in June. And they had sat in on a session titled Japanese American Artifacts Are Not Your Collectibles, which was about how individuals and groups have worked to ensure that the objects of the JA confinement experience don't get monetized, don't get sold off at auction to the highest bidder, don't get squirreled away by private collectors. And it was about the importance of families and communities having control over their heritage and what is done with it. And during the session, they also discussed the role of public institutions in ensuring that this heritage is preserved, well documented, and then when appropriate, made accessible to the public. And so from this session, Clement Hanami was thinking that it might be helpful during Tadaima to provide a session that offered information about collections and preservation work to make this process more accessible and more legible so that when and if families decide that they can no longer care for their aunt's camp journal or their grandfather's World War II uniform, they know that there are places where they might donate these and be assured that they are being cared for respectfully and with knowledge. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hear from representatives of 4 important organizations, and you'll learn about their collections, you'll learn about their collecting processes, and most importantly, you will get a glimpse of the work that is really, I think, underappreciated because it occurs behind the scenes outside of the gallery. And it's this huge lift that involves making sure that stuff, photographs, artwork, journals, uniforms, making sure that the stuff is cared for, it's conserved, it's housed, it's cataloged, so that it can be studied, so that it can be used in exhibitions, so that it can be a resource, not just for the book that's coming out next month or the exhibition that's happening in 2022, but really so that it is available as evidence, as touchstones to the past 100 years from now. So we are going to go now into 4 presentations, and we're going to start with Kristie Haertel, who is the regional curator and archaeologist for national parks in the Pacific West region, which includes the states of California, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and the far Pacific. That's a lot. She holds master's degrees in both museum studies and archaeology from the University of Washington. And the focus of her work is on the overall stewardship of collections and sites with an emphasis on preservation and interpretation. And you'll hear more about this from her, but her current efforts include improving the the access to collections and developing a long-range plan for collection storage. So please welcome Kristie Haertel.
Hi, it's very good to be here, and I can appreciate this topic. It's something that I've been studying for quite a while and trying to improve for all of the parks in the West. Again, I only represent really the parks in the West. We know that there's other sites, Japanese American confinement, incarceration sites in other parts of the nation, but those are the ones that I have some control over. So the first one that came online was Manzanar, and that was pretty early. That was 1992. And there was a lot of planning done around Manzanar with the idea that that might be the one place to showcase the majority of the Japanese American confinement story. But after Jeff Burton finished the confinement and ethnicity study, a lot of those sites became National Historic Landmarks, and now, of course, many of them are becoming monuments. And so Minidoka came to the National Park Service in 2001, Tule Lake shortly thereafter, and then, of course, most recently, Honouliuli. We also have one affiliated site, the Bainbridge Island site, that we work closely with too, especially those from Minidoka. So while I cover a big region, we do have a lot of standards. If you're ever interested in just all of the policies for the museum world, is for the National Park Service, there is the National Park Service Museum Handbook. It is dense, but it does go through a lot of the processes that we try to follow, and a lot of those chapters are updated to reflect kind of current practices in the museum world for the National Park Service. So one of the issues that we have is that as these sites have come online, not as a full entity, they've come in over the last 2 decades, each of these sites have been operating pretty independently. So they've been trying to maintain their own collection, complete all of the documentation and the guidance that you need for the type of collection, the scope of collections, and having their own advisory committees to make decisions about the care, acceptance and care of collections that come in. And what we're finding is that it has been difficult to really get a cohesive story and create, in the current digital media in particular, kind of the stories that we would want to, as the National Park Service, present out to the public for education, primarily education and interpretation, as well as enjoyment. And so what we're trying to do, with some nudging from a current review of the National Park Service Museum Program, is really trying and create something that's a little more holistic. So currently we don't have a single curator for these sites, and we would like to create that position and have a POC so that it isn't confusing for the community to come and say, well, I talked to so-and-so at this unit and they said this, and now we're here and maybe you're getting a different answer about things. So we're trying to create some consistency across those units and are looking to have an overarching story, but also the uniqueness of each of those sites represented in the collection, and just be a little more approachable for the community and others to have that access that has not been awarded to many. So when I say that we went through a review, the NAPA, it's the National Academy of Policy Administration, did a review, and they found that the National Park Service's planning for storage is not going to meet its goal. That was the big idea that they came with, and we really need to step up our game to get good storage facilities at these sites or consolidated. So right now we're in a planning effort to figure that out, and there will be a lot more to come on this, and it has more. It figures into the access issue that I think many folks are interested in hearing about. The collection that we have at these sites they come from archaeology. A lot of investigations have been done at these sites, and those are mandated collections, and we retain those in perpetuity. But the large amount of historic items have come through donations, and we anticipate continuing to do that, but we are also trying to develop a clearer scope so that there is a good understanding for everybody that what will be incorporated into the collection. We do have the range that I think many of the panelists here will talk about. The arts that were created there, the furniture that was created there, any aspect of stories from those. The one type of collection that is probably used the most is the archives. People really do resonate with historic photos and maps and a lot of the archives. So we do not anticipate stopping that collection. So we would like to grow it. We'd like to make it more cohesive. We'd like to make it more approachable. And those are the goals for going forward. In terms of the growth, there was an expectation from this review that we would limit growth. That was one of the recommendations. There was even a recommendation to pause accepting donations, and the National Park Service pushed back and said we can't do that, especially as we're having historic sites coming on into the system. That is an avenue that we need to do to fulfill our mission. But we do have to show some responsibility in how we're growing our collection. And this crops up. Tule Lake, for instance, when I talked to the curator and cultural resource chief there, they do have a very difficult time processing and advising on what collections to accept when donations are offered. So we're trying to find a way to make that easier and have more of a cohort through the collection advisory committees to assist with some of that decision making. The one thing that I really love about the National Park Service collections at these sites is that these are objects, some cases some specimens, and archives that are from the place. So you have the place and the objects there, and I do feel that really does lend itself to some pretty great exploration of the personal stories of people there and what they wanted to share. Our emphasis is on that experience and those stories. So we want to make sure that we're able to do that. Hanako did a fantastic job at Minidoka, and I think she'll continue that great work at Honolulu. But we want to keep in mind that the goal is to share the stories. So what does that mean as we move forward? There's just a ton of planning to do, and we have some really good minds working on how to move forward. I am looking forward to, and I'm hoping for future engagement. I know it's been very, very, very tough the last couple of years, of really developing better or stronger partnerships for these stories. We really do recognize the need for much better online content. I think that was kind of the silver lining of, and silver lining means creating a better focus for us on kind of the next things we need to provide. And online content is pretty necessary these days, and that is not something we do really well. We have some nice exhibits, we have some fantastic pictures, but again, it has not been a focus in the past. We've really looked to the place and the collection at the place for the preservation. So there's some opportunities there, and as Sojin's so beautifully put it, we can't do it alone. This has to be collaborative. This has to be a partnership. I don't think any of us have the full capacity to take any one thing on. So that we really are going to be looking at moving forward the online approach. I was asked a little bit to talk about the donation process. So a lot of our units do feel some angst with donations because it is a difficult process when you don't have the people on site when donations are made. So frequently donations are considered at the park. They're kept in a safe place, but with the capacity being elsewhere, it can take a little while to review those. And so I do want to alert the community that there is some lag time in that process. And I know it's uncomfortable for everyone. We are trying to do more trainings to make sure that we can make this move a little smoother. But we do recognize that that is an issue that we will have to address quickly. And I guess the final thing as to mention in a lot of this planning efforts that are happening is the vulnerability issue continues to come up. We're talking environmental vulnerabilities. And we definitely in the West are seeing a lot more pressure from the fires in particular. They haven't threatened these sites too much, but the infrastructure aspect of that does make it difficult to have a facility at some of these sites. And we need to be open and talking about that in greater detail as we move forward. So really the takeaway I want you to have is that we recognize some shortfalls, and we definitely are moving towards something a little more 21st century. And we need that engagement, and there is definitely opportunity to develop what that next phase looks like. And we look forward to meeting with you and talking more about that. I wasn't sure we would have that opportunity right away, but I think we're saving that to the end. Is that right, Joy and Sojin? I believe it is. That's really all I had to say. I'm not sure, Joy and Sojin, is the map up? I just wanted to kind of orient people a little bit if they can see the map.
Kristie, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so Joy has some images of yours. So would you like to cue us on which images you'd like to show and talk about?
Yeah, the first one I want to show is that map. So this is the one, I did one slide because I wasn't sure how much room you would all have, but I just wanted to show you how large our region is and how spread out. You have Minidoka in Hawaii, I'm sorry, in Idaho, Honolulu in Hawaii, Manzanar and Tule Lake are kind of at almost opposite ends of California. And then, of course, Bainbridge Island is up here close to me in Seattle, in the Seattle area. But I just wanted to show you that the distance between these does make some of this planning a little more difficult. And there are local groups that are definitely interested in each of these places. So we have to find some interesting and creative ways of how to manage as we move forward. So, and then I included some of the images of what are some of the most requested pictures or use of objects at these parks. And I just do think it's interesting that a lot of them, if they're not archives, do tend to be the art objects. And then I just also wanted to show some of the storage we have, which is the very standard for a lot of the suitcases or any of the built furniture, is very standard shelving in a museum storage facility. So, and that's all I had to say at this point.
Thank you so much, Kristie. It's really interesting to hear about how NPS is planning for the way that they'll be growing and managing sharing content in the future. And I think this issue of environmental vulnerability is so striking and sobering, specifically in the case of your sites and collections. I mean, I think it's something that all of us have to deal with in terms of the future, but I think especially where your sites are located. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And again, we're going to take questions at the very end. So we're going to move on to the second presenter, who is Rosalyn Tonai, the executive director of the National Japanese American Historical Society, which is based in San Francisco's historical J-Town. And she can tell you a lot more about the history of the organization. And I also realize that she needs very little introduction to this Tadaima audience, since she has, for a while been a really significant and influential builder of this network, really, that's collectively preserving Japanese American history. For example, she is a key figure who championed the creation of the Military Intelligence Service Historic Learning Center located at the Presidio's Kristie Field. So I'd like to turn over the screen to Rosalyn now.
Thank you, Sojin. Welcome, everybody. Thank you. I'm going to do a quick overview of the questions that were asked of me. And with the help of Joy, she could share the slides. And I'll just say next. So if we can show the first one. I've been here for quite a while, but not since the beginning. But and much of this I have to acknowledge is the work of collections manager Max Nihei, who during his tenure, the past 10 years, he has a master's in museum studies and specializing in collections from the University of San Francisco. And he's been working on various permanent traveling and rotating exhibitions, which includes the items in our collections. And next slide. This past spring, some of you have been seeing our virtual broadcasts where we shared our collections and how we do things and tied it in with genealogy. Next slide. So for 40 years, or 40 years ago, we were founded by Tom Kawaguchi and Chet Tanaka, and later joined by Hiro Takusagawa, who was, I believe, involved with Manzanar. And it was incorporated as the original Go for Broke Inc. in 1981. Its purpose was to tell the story of the military exploits of the Nisei soldiers of the 100th, 442, and Military Intelligence Service. And most of our collections began around that time and consisted of mostly Nisei soldier-related items. Next slide. Then the Go for Broke exhibit opened in 1981 at the Presidio Army Museum, and its goal was to get the stories out through exhibition and public programming and to the broadest possible audience. And next slide. One of our touring exhibits caught the eye of Roger Kennedy of the Smithsonian Institution for a special exhibition on the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. And from 1983 to 1986, the Historical Study became the primary collecting consultant to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History on A More Perfect Union, Japanese Americans and the U.S. Constitution. And if for those of you have seen it, it was up for quite some time. It lasted about 15 years through 2002. And then next slide. Change agents such as Dr. Clifford Ueda, John Taiteishi, who were vanguards in the JCL Commission redress movement, helped diversify our board and plot a broader path for the organization. And so since that time in 1986, we changed our name to the current one. Next slide, please. To reflect its broader purpose to capture and preserve the stories of the Issei immigration and settlement and World War II incarceration experience, as well as to cover the Sansei activists and other post-war stories. And next slide. And so what is the scale and the scope? Essentially, in the very broadest terms, the Ninjas, as we call ourselves, Ninjas, NJHS, collection consists of approximately 34,000 artifacts, photographs, documents, books, periodicals, and oral history interviews of Japanese American and Japanese diaspora experience. The collecting plan was driven by a project or exhibition-based approach. But to simplify, we have these 6 categories by subject. And so next, I'll just show you well, this is just the documents that we have in our documents collection. But there's 6 areas, categories: pre-war collections, World War II military collections, World War II eviction confinement, post-war collections, and we have special collections, and then our oral history interview collections. Next slide. And in the pre-war area, and these are going to get too small for you to read, but at least it's there in the documentation. People can go back and read it. Consists of primarily Issei immigration settlement periods, historic site surveys, portraits, family photographs, rural community photographs, objects that include furniture, luggage, clothing, cookware, and recreational items. Next slide. I think it also includes the Bishop Museum photographic collection, Taragawachi. The next area is the military collections of about 19,000 items consisting of military objects, uniforms, equipment, medals, insignia, patches, items collected overseas, such as documents, periodicals, psychological warfare, leaflets, translated documents, various photographs, correspondence, newspapers, clippings. These are all collected by Japanese American soldiers fighting the European theater and in the Pacific theater. As Nisei interpreters and Nisei soldiers in the MIS. This also includes the U.S. Army regimental records, journals, daily reports, and we also have the Joseph Harrington papers. He was the author who wrote Yankee Samurai. We have David Swift's papers, the MIS First Class, as well as captured POW journals. Next slide. Then we have this is more of the same thing in more detail. And next slide, we have the World War II eviction and confinement collections. This is this National Archives ones, but I'm primarily going to talk about the collections itself. But we do have copies of the National Archive eviction areas, which were collected way back in the 1980s. And I believe when Manzanar was planning its historic site, they came to us instead of going to the Smithsonian and digging through the archives because it was more convenient for them to collect the Manzanar pictures on the West Coast. The next slide. But essentially, these are all the confinement site lists and pictures, but the objects we have are various things that you are very familiar with, and a lot of them were featured in the Art of Gammon. Homemade furniture, luggage, these duffel bags, arts and crafts, various textiles, recreational items, various documents, periodicals, correspondence, scrapbooks, personal photographs. Those have created most of the bulk of those collections, and they're from various camp areas of the WRA. I think we have all of those 10 camps represented. We do have DOJ camps represented as well, particularly Missoula, Santa Fe, and Crystal City. Let's see, next slide. Then we have post-war collections, mainly of local Japantown redress, back in the day of San Francisco's redevelopment. And we have a late in August, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We don't have a slide for this, but another area was in special project collections that consist primarily of the Japanese American Women's Exhibit collection that happened in the 1990s, Tokyo Rose collection, the Dr. Clifford Ueda collection, the George Yoshida Reminiscing Swing Time. George Yoshida wrote a book on popular American jazz. And next slide. And then we have series of oral histories, not too many, but about 553 interviews of various folks, WRA, DOJ, number of hundreds, 442. We have the redevelopment oral histories. Japanese Peruvian Oral History Project we're a fiscal agent to, so we have some of their oral histories. And various, I guess, camp and also post-war as well. And we also worked with UC Berkeley on their Japanese American Alumni Oral History Project. And so, yes, next slide. How have you built the collection and how has it grown? Well, as I said, it was originally the Nisei Soldiers type of exhibit, and it grew from that to the Smithsonian exhibition, which covered the camp experience, and then through the women's exhibit and others. So today, the collecting plan focuses primarily on camp-related and military intelligence service-related items that could be shown at the MIS Historic Learning Center. The collection consists mainly of private and individual donations. And why is this collection important? Well, for obvious reasons, there's tremendous value for several reasons. One is that it's held in the community where it originated, and two, it's some of the rarest collections of unique 442 and MIS Nisei soldier objects, as well as some of the unique oral histories that were collected 40 years ago in the early 1980s. And so what does it look like today, and how do people bring their items to this collection or view? Very good question. Right now we have the collection, which is housed at our Ninja's headquarters in San Francisco's Japantown. We have a reference library and 2 off-site storage sites that house some of our large size permanent collections and our interpretive materials and publications. And the majority of the World War II military collections and WRA collections are stored in the archival cabinets and inventoried. Our oral history collection has been inventoried and stored in archival cabinets. And right now, the last since 2009, we've been working on the digitization of a lot of these collections so that it becomes publicly accessible. Now, being from the Bay Area, as you know, the archival storage space is very limited and very expensive. It comes at a premium. So while we're still accepting donations, but all these items must be screened and reviewed prior to acceptance. Our selection criteria is based on our collecting plan, which is reviewed and revised every 5 years, and by our collections committee. And for the most part, we are interested in items that are only originals with provenance and historical significance to the Japanese American experience, with priority going to World War II and MIS Nisei soldier experience. While we prefer to accept items that can be publicly displayed, we cannot guarantee that these donations will be exhibited since it's based on many, many factors. But for inquiries, you feel free to contact us or email Max Nihei at max@njahs.org. And so I could talk a little bit about our digital access, and our challenge is to make these long-held collections more publicly accessible, as you know. And with funding, thank you, from the Japanese American confinement sites grants, we've been able to achieve most of doing this for our World War II experience collections in partnership with the University of San Francisco's Gleason Digital Library. And you can go to our website. I think it's listed in here, and it's Ninja at confinement sites to look at the various collections. And primarily, the easiest thing to do is it's organized by, we have everything from architectural and site maps of the WRA camps that have been scanned that you could also download. And then next slide. See what we have here. We just recently completed the Nisei soldier collection of, obviously we don't have all the collections online. We have the featured ones online. So about 277 entries have been online, and they are publicly accessible. And then next, and in that series, we also have altogether about 1,300 of the total 34,000 entries items that we have. So it's only a snippet of what we have in our collections, but it gives you a good sense of a broad view of what we have in our collections. And people are welcome to go into there and take a look. The metadata is stored at the University of San Francisco, and we have a great relationship with them and with their students, and through the museum studies program and through our consultant, our collection consultant, Paloma Enoveros, who is a adjunct professor there. She uses her class to train them, and they come on site to learn about the Japanese American collections and experience, at the same time being trained on hands-on on how to conduct the collections, accession, and catalog and inventory them. And do some of the postings as well. Of course, this is a training program, and so they learn what they can in the classroom and also come on site. As well as we do take the interns after they completed the coursework in their master's program to do, paid internships as well. So this is a vital volunteer and little paid but worthy internship experience for all of them. And they go on to great things too as well. And Max is actually a graduate of the USF Museum Studies program, so very proud of that. Next slide, please. And recently we finished some of the oral histories in various formats. As you know, back in the day, there was various digital video formats, and so we were able to capture them audibly as well as video and begin to catalog them and make those accessible as well. And they include the Japanese Peruvian oral history projects that are sometimes in Japanese, English, and Spanish. Yes, next slide. And we talked about our gems. Well, I think the best thing to do is to tell people what we have on display currently throughout the country. And just some highlights are, next slide, if I recall, it's the, going back to A More Perfect Union, the Smithsonian still has on their website some of the objects that were featured in that. And those objects, circulate the country. And right now it is at the Presidio Officers Club as part of their exclusion exhibit, and it'll be coming back to us, and we'll be housing it at and displaying it at the MIS Historic Learning Center shortly. But the Sasaki blue suitcase trunk is featured there, and it circulates throughout the country if people want that, or it's housed at our site. Next. And there's a lot of collaboration going on with, we are participant with the National Veterans Network, which has recently, in collaboration with the new U.S. Army Museum and the Smithsonian Institution, American History, to tour the Congressional Gold Medal, the Nisei Soldier, has also, it's all a wonderful collaboration working together of featuring some of the objects online. And this is, I believe, on the Smithsonian Institution website. And we have loaned out Terry Nakanishi's dog tags and her famous V-mail to her brother who was killed in action, one of the last battles in World War II. So this is a wonderful collaboration of getting the information out, the stories out, as well as showcasing the objects at the new museum in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. So if you have a chance to get out there, please do so and take a look at the special Nisei Soldier exhibit. And I think finally there's one more. Oh, this is just a shout out to the National Veterans Network, who has been assisting. And the Masako Hirata 4th grade class quilt in Poston is on display at the Museum of Fine Arts. And I think the information is on the next slide, I'm not sure, but there it is, the Fine Arts Museum Boston. It's on display until January of 2022. So if you have a chance to see that, it's part of their Quilts of the Nation exhibit. I think it's a multicultural art exhibit. So that's on display right now, and it's on loan. So over in Boston. So yeah, please go see that as well. So that's in a nutshell, and we look forward to any sort of collaborations. I think the presentations are going to be really good, and the exchange will be excellent in the coming years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosalyn. Appreciate seeing that long arc, that long history of Indigenous. And you mentioned something. Rosalyn used the word provenance in her description of the criteria for when they accept things, and I think this is really important. Being able to establish the ownership or origins of something, right? So that you're not just getting stuff from people. You're getting stuff from people who owned them or their descendants own them, and this is important not just because it's, they're entitled to give it to you. They're not just finding something and giving it to you. But I think it also speaks to what I think all of the presenters, your organizations are involved in, is that you aren't just taking stuff to take it. You want to be able to document the story and the history behind the item to really capture the specific meaning and significance. And that's where being able to establish provenance also is really important. The other thing, Roz, that you talked about that I think is important, and we'll probably get to later, is just the issue of work. Like all of the people who are helping to catalog and care for materials, that there's just this enormous amount of human capacity that's involved in properly caring for things, for maintaining collections. It's not just like you receive something and you put it in a box and that's it. So, I hope that's something we can discuss more after in the Q&A. But next, I want to move along to our third presenter, who is Kristen Hayashi. She is a public historian who has worked on museum exhibitions and historic preservation advocacy, and whose family history has really directly influenced her academic and professional pursuits. So Kristen is currently the Director of Collections Management and Access and the Curator at the Japanese American National Museum in LA, where she works on exhibitions and she oversees the museum's permanent collection. Kristen holds a PhD in history from the University of California, Riverside, and she serves on the board of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation and the Little Tokyo Historical Society. And she has also written several historic landmark designations for sites that uniquely represent the Japanese American experience in Los Angeles. So Kristen, you're up.
Great. Thank you, Sojin. Greetings, everyone, from the Japanese American National Museum, located in Los Angeles' Little Tokyo. I'm currently at the museum, and I'm sitting in front of one of our largest artifacts in the collection. This is a barracks from Heart Mountain, Wyoming. So today what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to JANM's collection and provide you an overview of the work that we do here at the museum to take care of the collection, and talk a little bit about our process for how we acquire artifacts for the collection and how we make our collections more accessible to the public. So go ahead, Joy, you can advance the slide. So the Japanese American National Museum was incorporated in 1985, and around that time, the staff was working out of a warehouse or an office building, and they started to amass a collection. And this is prior to the museum opening to the public in 1992 out of the former Nishi Honganji Buddhist Temple building, which is still part of JANM's campus. And then now I'm currently sitting in the pavilion, which was constructed in 1999. And this is where the majority of collection storage is currently housed, literally in the center or heart of the museum. So I think the founders of the museum felt very strongly that it was important to have a museum that told the experience of Japanese Americans, since that wasn't sufficiently being told elsewhere in our nation's mainstream museums. And so from the very beginning, it was really important to capture individuals' experiences and stories, as Sojin was just mentioning, and to do that through oral histories, but also to anchor these stories to artifacts. And so that's why the collection, is so important. So this is one of the first objects to enter JANM's collection. This is from the Miyatake family, and so this is JANM collection 86.1, and that meant it was the first collection brought in 1986, and this included equipment from Toyo Miyatake's photography studio, including this early camera. So just, we remain a very active collecting institution and have been collecting for over 35 years. Next slide, please. So JANM's collection is very broad in scope and in geography and in chronology as well. So our collection parameters are essentially anything related to the Japanese American experience from early immigration, so mid to late 19th century to the present. And our collection is comprised of artifacts and artworks and photographs and historical documents, textiles and ephemera that really chronicle the Japanese American experience. Despite having that kind of broad scope, I would say that the strength of our collection really is the World War II experience, whether that's the incarceration or military service. And, you know, we still get quite a few donation offers. In fact, I think the majority of the offers that we do receive are artifacts that pertain to this time period. And as we know, this, you know, experience is very significant to many in our community. But, you know, it doesn't solely define us. So we definitely are looking to expand our collecting parameters and areas. I, you know, love to collect more in the post-World War II period and even more contemporary histories and themes and events. I think when the museum first started, the focus was on capturing Issei experiences. And so we do have, you know, a significant pre-war collection. But again, I think the strength really is the World War II time period. So, you know, I really am such a newcomer to JANM. I come following a very illustrious group of collections and curatorial staff, including Sojin, who really shaped the collection. And I really think that maybe the leaders the founders of this museum had, you know, a great vision for what the collection could entail, but I wonder if they ever realized that the collection would grow to the size it is today. So I'd like to sort of show you how the collection has grown and provide you with a glimpse into collection. So go ahead, Joy. So you got a little peek into collection storage. And as I mentioned, it's literally in the center of the museum. And it encompasses 2 floors, which totaling about 7,200 square feet. And you're probably wondering, you saw a lot of artifacts, you know, in those, in the film, in the video, and you're probably wondering how large a collection is. And I don't have the answer for that. And, you know, we sort of give this rough number of how many objects we have in the collection, but we don't really know. And that's partly because We don't count every single piece of paper. We don't catalog every single photograph. And so therefore we can't get like a completely accurate count. And that's pretty standard with archival collections or museum collections where you don't catalog at the item level like that. So it's always tricky to guess. We say we have 150,000 artifacts, but I know that that's, you know, a gross underestimate of how many objects we have. So let's see, I think you can go back to the slideshow. And we were sort of asked to come up with some hidden gems in the collection. And when you have a collection as large as ours, where every object is significant, it's really hard to choose. But I was asking some of the members of my team what some of their favorite artifacts are. And so you see a few here. So, you know, we have collections related to significant pop culture moments. Like here you see George Takei's Sulu costume from Star Trek. We have the papers of really significant figures, you know, in the Japanese American community. But I think what makes JANM's collection so unique and so significant is that, you know, chronicles the experiences of seemingly ordinary individuals, and therefore are so relatable and, you know, represent so many family histories. So some of the other gems that we see here, the top left corner, you see the Citizen USA manuscript. So Charles Ferguson, who was the director of adult education at Manzanar, created this manuscript while he was at Manzanar. And, you know, it's possible that it was meant to be a children's book. Sojin was very instrumental, I think, in bringing in this collection. And it's just this really incredible story of this fictitious girl, Jane Sato. But the collections team here at JANM did some research to identify who Jane Sato was. And so I'm going to give a plug for a series that we did, or that we have, called Unboxed. And you can find it on JANM's YouTube page. But it goes into sort of the research to finding out who Jane Sato was and using other collections that we have to try to do that detective work. The bottom there, you see photos from the Southern California Flower Market collection of all these families in the middle of flower fields before the war, which are really incredible. And it shows a different landscape of Southern California than you see today. Sort of in the bottom, in the middle there, is a Umeya rice cracker company rice cracker cutter. So you see the ume shapes. And so this is from the post-war period when they were manufacturing rice crackers at a really large quantity. And so this was like the cutter that would roll over the rice cracker dough and cut out the little ume-shaped rice crackers. The right there, you see a portrait of President Abraham Lincoln painted by Issei Sadayuki Uno on a piece of burlap. He painted this in one of America's concentration camps, and just the symbolism behind painting the great emancipator while he was incarcerated behind barbed wire on such a difficult medium, I think is really extraordinary. And then there's the I Am an American pin, which I just think is so poignant. This belonged to Frances Sasano when she was probably in junior high school, when she and her family were forcibly removed from the West Coast and ultimately sent to Amachi. And she wore this pin to camp and then later gave it to, her nephew. And I just think that, for this young girl to wear this, to have to proclaim to everyone that she was an American, feeling the need to do that, I think is very moving. And then the last thing I'll talk about is this labor contract, which you see in the center, and that's from Hawaii in the 1890s. And it's fascinating, all the information that's on this. It talks about the wage disparity between men and women. It talks about how these laborers had to work 26 days a month, and also that $2.50 from their monthly pay would be set aside for their return passage home to Japan. So these are just some of the gems in the collection, and there's so many more. Next slide, please. So a little bit about how we take care of artifacts in the collection. As you could see here and also in the video, we try to rehouse our collections once they're accepted in archival materials as a way to try to preserve them in perpetuity. So this is an acid-free box that some collection staff, they're rehousing this basket. We also try to control environmental conditions such as temperature and humidity and also light levels in collections. And on the right here shows digitization. This is really important, not only to make, the items accessible for the future, but it's a way for us to just sort of have these periodic checks of what the artifacts look like at different intervals of time. Next slide. So we periodically dust, as you can see here on the left. So trying to just eliminate anything that would attract common pests like moths that we probably all have in our homes. And on the right here, showing that we try to, just do condition checks of the objects periodically and ensure the safety. So when we were about to close the museum in March of 2020, John Tonai here, who you see, noticed that this window in the barracks behind me was very precarious. And so we deinstalled it and put it on a customized mount so that we can protect it. Next slide. We don't have a conservation staff here on site, but we work with conservators to treat objects. Like, for example, this Boy Scouts drum had a tear in the drum head. And so conservation is all about treating the objects in ways that can be reversed if necessary, and all the steps are documented. But they were able to mend the tear there. And on the right, we're showing this is the Heart Mountain Shumidan, and we're working with conservators to reattach roof tiles that have fallen off, over the years because the glue has gotten too dry and brittle. Next slide. So JANM, as I mentioned, is a very active collecting institution. We get donation offers constantly, and sometimes we make visits out to family homes to see artifacts like we did here with the Wadas and the Otanis. And then we usually document histories of the individuals that are related to the artifacts so that, we can create a more fuller portrait of the individuals and the artifacts. Next slide. And there's more information on our website. So if you go to janm.org, there's a section about our process for artifact donation, but we have a form we ask donors to fill out that provides background information, provenance about the artifacts. And then we do our own research to sort of corroborate that information. And then we write up a justification as to why we think the artifacts will complement our collections. And we present that to our collections task force and ultimately to our board of trustees who make the final decision. So if you have artifacts that you're interested in donating, please take a look at our website. Next slide. And we also try to make the collections accessible. So we have research appointments, not only for scholars and students, but also families to come and visit the artifacts that they've donated to the museum. And we also have information online. So through JANM's website, you can search some of our holdings. And we also have finding aids on the Online Archive of California, as well as through Densho and partnerships with the Cal State system and UC system. So I will wrap up there.
Thank you so much for that, Kristen. And I'm sort of blown away by the thought that there are 150,000, and that's a low count of items in the collection now. It's really very overwhelming. Also really appreciated the glimpse into the conservation process, because I think that that's so highly technical and so important and such a delicate process. For those of you who are tuned in, we have about another 15, 20 minutes of presentations, but we're going to open it up to questions. So please be thinking about questions you might have. This is a great opportunity to directly ask people who are working with these materials, these artifacts, and who are overseeing the process of accepting and caring for collections. So do put them in the comments. So we are now going to go to our fourth and final presentation. We have Brandon Daake, who since January 2020 has been the registrar at Heart Mountain, Wyoming Center, where he is responsible for the care of the archival and artifact collections. And Brandon previously worked across a wide array of archival and object-based collections, including at the Kenneth Spencer Research Library, Missouri Civil War Museum, the Watkins Museum of History, and the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics in Lawrence, Kansas. Brandon holds a BA in History and a BS in Historic Preservation from Southeast Missouri State University. He also holds an MA in Museum Studies from the University of Kansas. All right, Brandon, you're up.
Thank you, Sojin, and thank you for everybody for joining us today. Joy, I believe I sent you some slides yesterday, so if we could pull those up, that would be fantastic. We can get started. Thank you. So in many ways, we are, I think, the youngest organization. We were founded in 1996. We started collecting in 1999. Joy, you can go to the next slide. And sort of everything we do within the museum is, of course, related to our mission. And unlike, Kristie, who has an enormous geographical region to cover, or Rosalyn or Kristen, who have to cover time periods from the 19th century to the present, ours is, of course, limited just to Heart Mountain here in Wyoming. Now, we do collect everything related to Heart Mountain, such as, as you see, works of art, original photographs, administrative records, handmade items, and mass-produced items, but it is just those things related to Heart Mountain. Next slide, please. So just earlier this year in February, we did adopt a collections management policy that outlines our scope of collections fantastically. So if you just indulge me for a second, I'm going to go through that and show you an example of an item within the collection that matches up with that part of the scope of the collection. So our highest priority is, of course, items with a clear provenance of being made or used at Heart Mountain from 1942 to 1945. The item I have here for you is a butsudan made for the Uematsu family. That was made from wood from a vegetable crate or a fruit crate, and then left camp with them and stayed in their family for decades before it was donated last year to the museum. Next slide, please, Joy. Our second priority are the items from individuals who were at Heart Mountain, but then left, basically, and reflect their experiences relating to incarceration and their memories of it. So removal, resent, return to the West Coast, military service, of course, and resistance, which is, of course, a large part of the Heart Mountain story, especially with the Fair Play Committee. Here we have a uniform that was owned by George Teoka. He was a member of the Military Intelligence Service. He only spent a few months at Heart Mountain before he went to graduate school at the University of Toledo and then joined the Army, of course. And then in 2018, his uniform and papers were donated to Heart Mountain. Next slide, please, Joy. Also, the third priority are items related to incarceration at Heart Mountain, but not directly related to the Japanese American experience at Heart Mountain. So mostly looking at the white staff, or in this case, with this item here, the members of the military police detachment that guarded the camp. And this is a stone from a fireplace that was in a sort of visitor center at Heart Mountain. Next slide, please, Joy. Fourth priority are items related to the incarceration experience, but not explicitly Heart Mountain, which might not otherwise be preserved. So this is where we sort of branch out into mostly the assembly centers. As you can see here, this is a page from a Santa Anita pacemaker, the newspaper that was at the Santa Anita Assembly Center. And we do sort of limit it as well, though, to places that might otherwise be related to Heart Mountain. Next slide, please, Joy. And finally, our last priority is contemporary artworks that reflect on incarceration and the Japanese American experience. So here I have a painting that was made by Joe Nakanishi. Joe was a young adult when he came here to Hart Mountain, and he basically taught himself how to sketch, became an artist while he was at camp. He always intended to turn those sketches into paintings, but it took him until about the 1990s to do so. He started working when his eyesight started failing. So his paintings that we have here, made in the 1990s, made from his sketches that were created at camp in his memory. And much like Kristen's point about scope, it's hard to say how many exact artifacts or pieces of paper that we have, and it's not something that I love to guess at because I don't want to be that inaccurate with it. Next slide, please, Joy. So like I said, we've been collecting since 1999, and I would be remiss if I did not mention LaDonna Zoll, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. LaDonna was, in many ways, sort of the go-to agent on the ground for the Hart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation that our board largely created or constructed of former incarcerees and their families, and they live all across the country. LaDonna was the person who could take people on tours of the site and stepped up to be the first curator. As you can, and in this picture here, you have a look at the first sort of collection storage that was utilized by the foundation, which is a vault and a bank. Next slide, please, Joy. And here we have one of the very first items donated to the foundation was donated by former incarceree Shigeru Yabu. And that is, I think, something that has been fascinating is from such a young organization, it feels like we've always had the support of our board members and former incarcerees that they've been involved with us from the very first day. Next slide, please, Joy. And as you can see here, the collections storage part of the current Hart Mountain Interpretive Center is, of course, named for LaDonna, and this is what it looks like today. A great step up from the bank vault that it used to be in. Next slide, please, Joy. So how to donate an item? It's fairly simple, more or less. The biggest thing is that we just want to have a conversation with the people that are donating these items. They can contact me at either of those two email addresses there, and we will send a person two forms. They look like this, the Provenance form, just like Kristen and Sojin and Rosalyn have made a point about Provenance. We want to know who's owned this thing, what's its story, and things like that. And then we will do, of course, our own research. And I, in consultation with Dakota Russell, who is the executive director of the museum, will determine if an item matches our scope and matches our collection and will make a good addition. Next slide, please. So, like everybody else, I've selected a few highlights from our collection. This particular item is about to be centered in a exhibition we're going to hold at the Center of Recent Acquisitions. This is a braille board. It was created by a man named Tokinobu Mihara, who, before he came to Hart Mountain, had been diagnosed with glaucoma for years. And he had a specialist in San Francisco that kept his eyesight functioning and useful. However, when he came to Hart Mountain, of course, the limitations of resources meant that there were no specialists on the staff of the hospital, and the administration would not let him go to see a specialist in, say, Billings, Montana. So unfortunately, while he was here, Tokinobu went blind. As part of that, he created a braille system to be used with Japanese and to be taught to other people who were vision impaired or blind so that they could still communicate and read things in Japanese. Next slide, please. Also, one of our probably the most famous stories of Heart Mountain is that of Estella Shigo, the white woman who was married to a Nisei man and voluntarily was incarcerated with her husband, and documented her experience through a series of extraordinary pieces of art. So here we have a sketch from our Estella Shigo collection. And I also like to bring it up because it's one of our ways that we get to collaborate with Kristen at JANM, because they also hold a series of Ishigo paintings from the Eaton collection that they have lent to us, and we exhibit at the center, and one of the ways that we overlap. Next slide, please. Another one of my favorite stories at Heart Mountain is that so many people came here from, of course, Southern California, a nice sunny place. And if you've ever been to Wyoming, especially in the winter, it is the exact opposite of nice, sunny, and warm. But for many of the people here, it was also their first chance to try something new, like ice skating. So people would order ice skates from Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward, and several ice rinks were created within the blocks of barracks for people to go ice skating. Next slide, please. And finally, we do have a few rolls of camp toilet paper even. That's how extensive our collection can be. According to the story that goes along with these pieces, they fell off a truck that was on its way to Heart Mountain and kept by a local family who then donated it to Heart Mountain once the museum was founded. Next slide, please. So really within that scope of collection, we even have 4 collections that we utilize. Our main collection, which is what most of our artifacts, or what all of our artifacts and archival materials exist in, receives the most care. It's what we exhibit, things like that. We also have a reference collection that is accessible to researchers, and a prop collection that are items that maybe from the time period, but not related to Heart Mountain or even Japanese American incarceration as a whole, but are good for exhibits and use of things like that. And finally, we have an education collection, which is full of secondary sources and books related to incarceration and the Japanese American experience in the United States as a whole. We are working on, of course, digitizing our collection. Heart Mountain is a very remote location here in Northwest Wyoming, especially when winter sets in, as it's getting ready to do. So hopefully, knock on wood, next month, we will be able to launch a digital platform that allows people to look at our collection, see images, and access the information contained within. I think that's about all I have. So I'm happy to turn it over to Sojin and Joy, and we can, I guess, get to the question and answer part.
Thank you so much, Brandon. The Heart Mountain collection, as you noted, as being one of the newer collections. It's really, really interesting for me to see the things there, and that Braille board just blew my mind. I'm almost distracted by how incredible that item is. So we're getting some questions, and Joy is bringing everyone back on screen, and then I think we are going to start with the first question. So I'm documenting the artifacts I have, primarily photos. How much documentation should I complete before initiating an artifact donation offer? This from James Okamura.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel that if you are planning to donate, it's great to reach out early and ask whichever institution you're choosing to donate what they want to see. I think that just really helps. If you're thinking about it and just putting your feelers out, how much documentation really comes down to those issues from where I sit of ownership. Do you actually own own the image, that has to be researched. That's a big one. And how you intend to use it has to be pretty clear. And then the provenance, as we've mentioned before, understanding how it came into your possession. Those are all really key parts to, I think, that documentation in terms of the date, the time, and who's in it is, is important too, but those other ones are key to understanding if that institution, or for us, the National Park Service, can actually take it. And I'm sure we all fall under the same museum ethics, so I think that we're all probably falling in that similar zone.
Thank you, Kristie, for that. Is there anything that anyone would want to add, or should we go on to the next question?
I think, I might say that we probably can't give you a really strict or straight answer about that. I think it's case by case, but, it'd be nice to know who is in the photographs, for example, right? But that's not absolutely necessary, because it's probably impossible for you to be able to identify everyone. Sometimes, the subject matter of the photographs is what's so interesting, and it might be an area that, we just don't have a lot of photographs representing. So, I would just, whatever documentation, you're able to sort of glean through some light research, I think would be really helpful to any of these organizations.
Yeah, I just want to add that for any documentation that you could write on the identification of people in the photographs, where it was taken, when it was taken, all those are really important. For your own, family benefit. And it may be that the institution may not take all the images, or just may take one or two. But in that case, that information needs to be passed on with each item, each photograph. So I think anytime you can just tease any of that information out, the better for everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Brandon, anything to add, or shall we move on to our next question?
And I think they've pretty much all covered it. I would say, also include who took the photograph. That can be another great piece of information for us to have as well.
Excellent point. All right, we have another question here. This is from Fuji Design. So this question is, if an artifact donation inquiry is rejected from one of your organizations, do you ever refer the donating party to another organization?
Yes. It seems like we get so many offers of suitcases or luggage that was used to carry belongings, to camp. And of course, they're very poignant objects, but they take up a pretty large footprint in our collections. And so we can't take in every single one that we're offered. So if we know that the trunk is related to Heart Mountain, we will contact Heart Mountain to see if they would be interested in it. Or there are other potential repositories too. So we try to find a home for the objects.
Yeah. I think it's important to note that while we may all overlap, we're not, I don't think, ever in competition with each other. So I don't think any of us ever have any qualms about referring to somebody else.
That's a really great way of saying that, Brandon. Yeah, we definitely would prove, if we are unable to care for it or take it on, we would definitely want to see it with a partner institution. So yeah, no competition, happy to spread the word.
Thank you, guys. I think that's really helpful. And we have another question. Someone wanted to, I think this is a great one. Someone wanted to know, Janice, what is an example from your prop collection? I think, is this for Brandon specifically? I can't remember if others talked about a prop collection.
I would imagine probably. I think one of the best examples is old pieces of luggage. I think, like Kristen's mentioned, we do have some pieces of luggage that came to camp, but otherwise we may just have a 40s or 50s suitcase that kind of works with an exhibit that we can use to sort of fill up space, especially looking at our recreation of barracks rooms, that we have a section that's behind glass and full of original artifacts. We also have a section that's not behind glass, and we have full of sort of items from that prop collection that we can show people what may look like.
Thank you. let's see, there's so many questions coming in. I'm having trouble finding them. Okay. Did any of you experience an uptick in donation inquiries during the pandemic period? Because more people were at home and cleaning up things and discovering hidden treasures. Great question.
That is a good question. I feel like the requests, at first I feel like there was a delay, and then people just had time to either do the research or look for objects that they want donated. So then in some ways we were getting people contacting us, but the collections were larger, I think is one of the issues we found. But I don't feel like it ultimately, the number of people contacting us didn't change that much after the first, say, 5 months.
Did anyone else experience that?
We thought that with the popularity of Marie Kondo and Sparking Joy and cleaning out your houses, we get a lot more donation offers. Same thing with the pandemic, but I think we experienced the same thing where there was a lull, and maybe it's because the museum here closed, and so people just assumed we weren't working. But then it's been pretty steady since.
And I wanted to go back to an earlier question. There's a follow-up question, actually, Brandon. I'm not sure if you fully described what a prop collection is.
Yeah, sure. So a prop collection is items that they may be from the time period, but have no relation to Heart Mountain or Japanese American incarceration, but can be used to sort of fill up space or make an exhibit more full. Thinking especially about our example barracks rooms, that we may have like a cigarette pack from the 40s or a can of tobacco or something. Sort of small items, can be even bigger items like vintage clothing as well, that can help make that space sort of feel lived in and used, especially.
Thank you. All right, this is probably a more technical question, and I think this is a really important one. So we have another question that is, what issues might complicate or prevent an artifacts offer for digitization to Densho and then physical donation to JANM, Ninjas, Heart Mountain, NPS?
Okay, I'll try to tackle this one. So I think the question is, like, let's say you have a collection of photographs and you allow Densho to scan them and include them in their digital repository, and then you want to donate the physical prints to one of the organizations here. So I sort of see that this is going to be something that's going to come up a lot more in the future, but I think maybe the complication might be with copyright rights and usage. So who would own the copyright? Who would be able to use the images? So typically when we accept an artifact into the collection, we have the donor sign a deed of gift, which transfers legal ownership to the museum, from the donor to the museum. And there's also a clause in there that says, do I hold copyright? And if I do, I'm turning it over to the museum. So I think that might be what just needs to be worked out. And maybe it would just be an agreement between Densho and the organization that becomes the repository for the items, just to make sure that, both organizations can still use it. But again, that's not a hard answer. I think it's probably case by case, but that is what I see as the complication. But I don't think you should let that deter you. I think you should still have a conversation with all the organizations involved.
Following up on that question, are there other things that would make a donation hard to accept?
Sometimes the lack of provenance can make it hard for us to accept, especially if, I think I think of some things that maybe aren't really unique to the places in particular. So, Minidoka, if it's something similar, but you just don't know really where it came from, that makes it very hard, I think, for us to accept donations in those cases. We do want to make sure we're doing right by the community, and also, legal ownership is definitely an issue. So I think that's one of the biggest ones for us.
And just to extend that a little bit more, Kristie, what you said about being responsive to community, being mindful and respectful of community. I know all of you do that in heaps and bounds. You're so respectful, and you really think about how to consult and engage, and again, respond to the needs and concerns of the communities whose history you're preserving. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that responsibility and how that can sometimes also present challenges too in the ways in which you do your work, or the way in which sort of collections traditionally, conventionally have been handled by institutions.
Okay. So the collaboration, the National Park Service, our museum objects are different because of the place-based issues. So the preservation of place is really core, and so the collections, enhance that in many ways, and they enhance the interpretation. We do not have kind of access to the money that institutions that have a building and a place, one place and one building or several, to really invest in one thing. And I think that makes it hard. And so from where I sit and where the Park Service generally operates is how do we convey these stories? How do we capture the stories? How do we talk about and exhibit them? And a lot of that really comes down to collaborative efforts. They have to be presented in a sensitive way with the intention of the person who is sharing that. I mean, that can be very difficult to get to when you have these tangible objects or materials, is the sensitivity in use and the sensitivity towards that story in particular. And yeah, many organizations have a capacity issue, but I think we're finding that to do this responsibly, we need to put a little more focus towards that side of stewardship, is honoring the stories in the way intended. So does that get a little bit to what you were thinking, Sojin, or do you want me to expand? And anybody else can jump in on that as well.
No, thank you for that. And that's really a question for everyone, because again, you have to weigh your responsiveness and your accountability to communities who you are serving, but also you all have this responsibility to physically care for things. And I'm just wondering about some of those challenges, that balance, how you maintain that.
The only thing I would want to add, and I do think that's why having a network is really helpful, is part of honoring stories, especially when they come with tangible materials like artifacts or objects. If it is difficult for us to care for, or we can't promise that we can care for it, then it is something that we would encourage you to find another institution for. And historical items do tend to take up space, and that has, there's implications for that down the road.
Sort of going back to the previous question about, are there any challenges, or why might it be hard to accept some things in the collection? And oftentimes donors will say, like, I would like to give this to your museum, but I want it to be on display permanently. And, that's something that we can't promise. And I just want to talk about some of the other ways that a collection is useful. And it's not just in exhibitions, but it's useful to researchers. It's useful to your family, later on when they want to learn more about their family history. And now that we have this ability to digitize and make things more accessible online, not everything needs to be physically displayed. So physical display over a long time is not good for the artifact. And that's why we can't really make a promise. We want to preserve these things in perpetuity. So I just sort of want to put that out there, because just because your family's artifacts aren't on display doesn't mean that they're not valued or, important. So that's one thing. And yeah, I think they're oftentimes, we know that families and individuals take so much pride in all of these collections because we are the keepers of, family treasures. And sometimes descendants will say, I know my grandfather donated, X, Y, and Z, but we'd really like to have it back. And that's something that we can't just easily do because, legal title has been entrusted into the, the museum. So there's sort of things like that where I think, people just value everything that we have so much. And we have to sort of think about ultimately the care of the artifacts long term. And so it's difficult to sometimes meet all of the requests that we get. But it's a balancing act. And we try to make them accessible, but
Thanks, Kristen. And the other thing that struck me is so many of you are involved in the digitization of your collections. And I would say that that's another way in which actually, although people's materials are not being physically put on exhibition, with this push by so many organizations to digitize, this is going to be another means through which a lot of these collections will actually become accessible, as digital surrogates to the public. And I think that's fantastic. So we're getting close to needing to wrap up and pass it back to our hosts, Joy Yamaguchi, but I just wanted to ask each panelist if maybe, and this was a question that came in through the chat, is, you have these incredible collections, but if there was one item that you sort of always wish you would come across or might get left at your doorstep, what object, what item would you be wanting to add to the collection, or what are you actively still looking for?
I'll just throw out this. We have an exhibition that we are mounting on the Department of Justice camps, and I think different institutions as well. JANM has been doing so too. But I think that's the other story of the Department of Justice internment camps, and there's a lot of them. And it's not just Japanese Americans, but German and Italian enemy aliens as well, and that captures a different story. So, and of course, it's the Japanese Latin American story as well. So I think for us that might be a priority because it's one of our JAX funded projects right now.
Brandon, Kristen.
I will say that each of the units are looking for particular issues related with people that were there. And I'd have to look. I didn't prepare that. I didn't even think about that.
Not a trick question.
That would be a question, but I will say those objects or items that we tend to still really enjoy receiving are a lot of the archives that really do shed light. Again, being a place-based, having that greater understanding, whether that's the artwork, or pictures, or oral histories, whether they're transcribed or recorded, are just really important to our places. We are not. We don't have the same level of exhibits that other institutions do. Maybe someday, but we don't now. So items to exhibit is not high on our list right now. So.
I have to be careful what I say because we're going to get lots of offers. I'm just kidding. But, I'd like, as I mentioned, I think we need to, move beyond the World War II narrative here at the museum, since we already have such a strong collection. We'll still collect in that. But I'd like to see, more post-war items that show sort of intersections between the Japanese American experience and other communities. So, Sojin, I really want a gardener's truck and something that maybe a Japanese gardener passed down to a Latino gardener who took over his clients or something like that. I don't know. If anyone has a truck, pickup truck.
Yeah, it's certainly not an easy question, really. I think what sort of popped into my head is we have several great resources. Among them are Frank Emmy's papers, which of course document the Fair Play Committee and draft resistance within Heart Mountain. And I think thinking about that, something related to the actual prison experience of the Fair Play Committee members who went to, say, McNeil Island or Fort Leavenworth, kind of maybe things related like that would be very interesting to have come across our doorstep.
Thank you guys for, oh, Roz, oh no, you were, sorry, you guys all said them. Thank you. I mean, I think that all that stuff is out there, and I hope they find their way to you somehow. I just wanted to shout out too that someone has just mentioned in the chat a project to collect and preserve stories of Japanese Americans in Pasadena, and I hope that person can reach out to some of these resource people here as you move forward with that project. I want to thank all of the presenters for being here, not just for being here actually, but for everything that you do every day. Your work is so important. I want to thank Joy and Clement and JANM for putting together this session, and I'm going to now turn it back to our host, Joy Yamaguchi.
Hi, Sojin. Thank you so much. I am really grateful that you all joined us here tonight. And as Sojin mentioned, my name is Joy Yamaguchi. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Japanese American National Museum. And we are so excited that we could present this program tonight as part of the Tadaima 2021 Virtual Pilgrimage. Please check out all the other wonderful programs happening as part of Tadaima. You can find links to that. And as Sojin mentioned, to reach out to all of our panelists and learn about all the different organizations' work at the links in the chat as well. I just want to take a quick second to shout out to our panelists, all the wonderful things that folks are saying. Stacey mentioned earlier that as a archaeologist, it was really great to have this program, and we have folks joining us from all across the country and to learn about all of these, all the work that you all are doing. And a special shout out, thank you to Sojin. We miss having you at JANM, of course, those 10 years, and I'm glad that Kristen mentioned the wonderful work that you did then. But thank you for moderating this panel, and thank you to Brandon, Rosalyn, Kristen, and Kristie. We are just really grateful for your time and your expertise. So with that, please stay connected. Please visit JANM. We're open again if you are able to come to visit us in the LA area, and tune in for all the rest of the programs. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for being here, and have a really great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks much.